Welcome to this Finding Pictures presentation on Indigenous American creators and our collections. We'd like to start out with a land acknowledgement. Located near the confluence of the Potomac and Anacostia Rivers, the Library of Congress acknowledges the Indigenous peoples of the United States, including the diverse Native communities who make their home in this area today. We pay our respect to the people, past and present, of the Nacotchee, Anacostan, Piscataway, Kanoi, Pamunkey, and Manahoac nations, the first peoples and custodians since time immemorial of the land where the library now provides its services. I'm Melissa Lindberg, a reference specialist in the Prints and Photographs Division, and I'm joined today by my colleague, Catherine Blood, curator of fine prints. The Library of Congress Prints and Photographs Division has tens of thousands of images in our collections that relate to Indigenous communities. A small subset of those images were created by Indigenous people themselves. Today, we'd like to celebrate these artists and their works in our collections. For the last several decades, the Prints and Photographs Division has made acquiring works by Indigenous creators a collecting priority, beginning with a 1998 acquisition of work by artist John Quick-to-See Smith. We remain committed to building this important part of our collection. Given the focus of the presentation today, we'll note tribal affiliations of artists based whenever possible on how artists self-identify. We acknowledge that creators often have multiple heritages and identities that may be more complex than described. The earliest known works in the Prints and Photographs Division collection by an Indigenous creator are photographs by Richard Throssell, including this image titled Evening on the Little Bighorn, that shows a view of trees and teepees reflected in water. Of Métis Cree origin on his mother's side, Throssell was born in 1882 and grew up in Washington State. He moved to the Crow Reservation in south central Montana in 1902, where he worked as a clerk for the Indian Service. In his time on the Crow Reservation, he purchased his first camera and began to learn the basics of photography. Throssell was a contemporary of other photographers who tended to portray Native people through a romanticized lens and the pictorialist approach that was popular around the turn of the 20th century. He even met and worked with Edward S. Curtis, whose photos of Indigenous Americans are among the most widespread and recognizable from that period. And indeed, we have over 2,000 Curtis images in the Library of Congress collections. In some of Throssell's photographs, the pictorialist aesthetic is evident, as in this photo, with its soft, dreamlike focus. Throssell's circumstances were a bit unusual for a photographer of Indigenous people at the turn of the 20th century, in that he himself had Native roots and was formally adopted into the Apsallaka community a few years after his arrival on their land. While Throssell experimented with pictorialist techniques, some of his photographs reflect a more documentarian style. Because of his close relationships with community members, he was able to capture some moving, intimate shots of individuals who were likely more at ease in his presence than they would have been with an outsider. This view, titled Under the Willows, shows a small child on a blanket in the presence of two caring adults. One of the adults is faced away from the camera and clearly engaging with the little one, while the other is tending to a fire in the background. The child gazes unflinchingly at the camera. Let's fast forward nearly a century to look at photographs by Zig Jackson, who is the first Native American photographer whose work was actively acquired by the Prints and Photographs Division starting in the early 2000s. Jackson grew up on the Fort Berthold Indian Reservation in North Dakota, home to the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara Nation. Jackson's many achievements include being the first Native American to earn an MFA in photography from San Francisco Art Institute in 1994 and receiving a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2021. Some of the earlier works by Jackson in our collections interrogate the notion that the default perspective is, or should be, Eurocentric. We see that here in this image titled Indian Photographing Tourist Photographing Indians at the Crow Fair in Montana, which is in that same general area where Richard Throssell would have been making his photographs of Apsallaka people many decades previous. By photographing a white tourist photographing Indigenous people at point blank range, Jackson highlights the absurdity and intrusiveness of the act. While in graduate school at the San Francisco Art Institute, Jackson made photographs for his Entering Zig's Indian Reservation series, which he's described as being akin to performance art. In the images, he wears tribal regalia and poses next to one sign reading, Entering Zig's Indian Reservation, and another reading, private property, no picture taking, no hunting, no air traffic, and New Agers prohibited. The locations for these shots are as varied as San Francisco City Hall, the Golden Gate Bridge, and in this case, Hutchinson Island, Georgia, across the Savannah River from an industrial facility. Like many of the photographs by contemporary Indigenous photographers in the collection, this image highlights environmental concerns. Our most recent acquisition of work by Jackson consists of his Guggenheim portfolio photographs, which counter earlier European American ideas of a romanticized and caricatured vanishing Indian. In these images, we instead see Native American people, including Jackson's friends and family members, living normal lives at home, making evident the presence and resilience of Indigenous people today. Jackson's rich narrative pictures are full of detail. In this picture, we see Bob and Mary Apicito and family members hanging out in a shaded outdoor space outside their adobe house in Alamo, New Mexico. The beautiful New Mexico landscape is visible in the background, along with some storm clouds. Christine and Dorothy Tiger, who are Sock and Fox and Pawnee, are seen in this photograph. After Christine's husband Mitch passed away, her niece Dorothy began to take care of her. It's hard not to focus on the many pictures and other decorations on the walls and refrigerator, including a portrait of a man in military uniform at top left, who is Christine's husband Mitch, and a POW MIA sign, a reminder that American Indians serve in the military at the highest per capita rate compared to other ethnic groups. The TV tray holding Kleenex and a large container of water with straw will look familiar to many of us who have recovered from an illness or served as caregivers for others. In addition to photographers, Indigenous American printmakers are also represented in the collections. Silkscreen prints by Potawatomi artist Woody Crumbo are the earliest known graphic artworks by an Indigenous artist that were added to the Prints and Photographs Division collections. The beautiful color-saturated prints seen here were acquired through the copyright registration process in 1952, along with 10 additional silkscreen prints by Crumbo. Crumbo was an artist with seemingly unlimited creative interests, whose craft crossed many forms, including music, dancing, and the visual arts. His work often reflected influences from multiple tribal communities. And now I'm going to hand it over to Catherine.
Thank you, Melissa. As you mentioned earlier, our acquisition efforts in recent decades have emphasized adding artists' first-person visual voices, as well as diverse subjects, styles, techniques, perspectives, places, heritages, and more. In 1998, the Library of Congress collected its first work by a contemporary Native artist printmaker, and that was Jean Quick-to-See Smith, an enrolled Salish member of the Confederated Salish and Kootenai Nation of Montana. Quick-to-See Smith is also a renowned educator, activist, and curator. The library currently has 4 prints by Jean, including this 1991 example, which was acquired in 2020, called Winds of Change. The piece was published by the Lawrence Lithography Workshop in Kansas and used to raise funds for University of Wisconsin film of the same name about changes on Indian reservations. Jean regularly explores themes of environmental health, social and political justice and injustice, personal and communal identity, and more through storytelling images that blend modern and traditional elements. Horses, including her own horse Cheyenne, are recurring features, and we see here how nature and man-made elements inhabit this space. You see water and land, animals and insects, a truck, airplane, sun, moon, stars, people, and there's also a beautiful blending of modernist, abstract, and figurative styles. This lithographic image has a beautiful, luminous, powdery quality with passages that look a lot like chalk or pastel. It really glows. Reflecting personal, communal, and historical memory, Jean's 2014 lithograph called Waiting for Rain is on the left, And it's referencing a central figure based on the right hand 19th century portrait of a Mandan man by Swiss artist Karl Bodmer. Uh, Looking on the left, he's surrounded by insects and animals. That bird in the lower right corner, for example, is based on a drawing by Wilfredo Lamb from Cuba. And there are lyrics from the song at the top, "You Are My Sunshine." On the left, it says, "Listen up, humans." And all of these clues combine to suggest precious, finite ecological resources. The artist is a gardener, and she made this after a long 5-year stretch of drought. And the artist's choice to highlight Bodmer's portrait of a Mandan man whose name was recorded as Eagle's Beak is meaningful too. Bodmer began the watercolor on which the later print is based at Fort Clark, North Dakota in 1834, toward the end of a 2-year expedition through the Missouri River frontier. Within 4 years, smallpox outbreaks nearly eradicated North Dakota's Mandan population. And this connects with another ongoing theme in the artist's body of work, that we mutually hold each other's well-being in our hands. MacArthur Award-winning artist Wendy Red Star, who was raised on the Montana Abselica or Crow Reservation, created this series of lithographs that explore and celebrate her own intergenerational family history. The quadruple portrait on the left, which is one of my personal favorites, shows her great-great-grandmother, whose Crow name is Her Dreams Are True, or in English, Julia Bad Boy. Red Star discovered the photographic portrait that you see here. It was taken by Freddie Miller at the turn of the 19th century. She found it during the course of her own archival research at the National Museum of the American Indian. At the center, 4 generations shows the artist's grandmother and father, who was a Marine, her daughter, and herself. And then dust at the right shows Red Star's great-great-grandfather wearing his Crow tribal police badge. Now, all 3 of these prints are set against colorful and complex star quilt patterns, and the artist explains that these quilts were very precious and gifted and shared at ceremonial rites. These prints were published by the Crow Shadow Institute of the Arts, located on the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation in Oregon. And we'll be seeing many more examples from Crow Shadow in the mix as we continue. Our Crow Shadow Institute collection is one of our jewels. Here's another intergenerational portrait by and of artist Wendy Red Star, made in collaboration with her daughter Beatrice. With contemporary flair, that's their IKEA couch in the image. They present themselves as their own shapers and catalysts for the here, now, and future, also honoring heritage and tradition. Red Star explains the significance of the elk tooth dresses that they're wearing, which traditionally signal rank and wealth. This is a quote from the artist. She says, "The dress has power. You feel strong and regal wearing it. In my art, the elk tooth dress specifically symbolizes Crow womanhood and the matrilineal line connecting me to my ancestors." And that's the end of the quote. That phrase, Absolica Feminist, began, by the way, as an Instagram hashtag the artist created to invite image sharing and discussion about the culture and history of Crow women. And now I'll send it back to Melissa.
Thank you, Catherine. So, like the Wendy Red Star images in the previous slides, this photographic work by Dene artist Dakota Mace explores aspects of her community's identity. Mace is an interdisciplinary artist who works with weaving, beadwork, and papermaking in addition to photography. The Chemogram series seen here was created entirely in a darkroom without any use of a camera, using chemistry-based photographic processes. The process begins by exposing light-sensitive photo paper with the symbols first placed on top to prevent exposure in those areas. Mace then paints developing chemicals on the sheet to add texture that mimics natural elements such as rock, vegetation, and animal life. Each of the 40 individual prints seen here measures 6 by 4 inches, so the full series is quite large. The series, which is called So or Stars in Navajo, was created in the community's iconographic tradition. The image shows 4 rows of repeating symbols. The symbols in so represent concepts integral to the memory and history of the Dene people. The top row represents Spider Woman, a Dene deity who is a teacher to weavers. Next comes 4, which represents the cardinal directions. Then Mountain, which refers to the sacred peaks encompassing the expanse of the Dene homeland. And finally, we see Whirling Log, which embodies balance. According to Mace, the 40 prints that comprise the piece are, quote, similar to the Dene philosophy of how we're all connected. So even though we have our own thoughts and memories, altogether we create a collective identity and our belief of going back into the land and being as one within place. Will Wilson is another Dene photographer who makes use of innovative photographic processes in his work. Wilson's work for his critical Indigenous photographic exchange series invites the participation of Indigenous artists, tribal citizens, professionals such as curators and academics, and others, encouraging them to pose themselves as they wish to be seen. Wilson's approach is in direct opposition to historic and often exploitative approaches by non-Indigenous photographers such as Edward Curtis in the early 20th century, who were known for manipulating an image to align with their own worldview or perspective. To create his images, Wilson uses the historic wet plate collodion process to produce a tintype, which he then reproduces in a digital format before giving the original to the sitter in exchange for the use of the digital copy. Wilson then uses the digital file as the basis for prints that he produces in the darkroom, resulting in evocative images that somehow appear at once old, new, and timeless. In this platinum print, we see Eric Garcia Lopez, a dancer and a member of the Purepecha tribe, whose blurred, moving hand in this photograph highlights the kinetic nature of his artistic craft. One of my favorite photographs by Wilson in the collection is this image of the photographer with his family, including his wife Carla Contupis, who is a violinist and educator, and their 2 children. You may have noticed the framing around the perimeter of this image, and also in the photo of Eric Garcia Lopez on the previous slide, which is a result of the way the collodion emulsion was poured onto the original tintype plate. In this photo, we see a sort of half moon border at the top, which is reminiscent of framing we sometimes see in older photographic formats, such as stereographs. The pouring of collodion takes place in the dark, leaving a lot to chance, so the resulting artifact may have been serendipitous. Here we see examples of artwork by Osage artist Norman Akers that center an Indigenous perspective on the arrival of Europeans and European Americans on traditional tribal lands. The monoprint on the left, Arrival 3, depicts 3 canonical figures in U.S. history: Alexander Hamilton, Ulysses S. Grant, and George Washington, all as alien like figures arriving in spaceships. Their presence also evokes the history of government policies that led to devastating results for Indigenous Americans, including forced cultural assimilation and the extensive loss of lands. The stark silhouettes of birds represent migration, and the fragmented map in the background pieces together places, including parts of Kansas and Oklahoma, where the artist has worked and lived. On the right is a photograph of a mural by Akers that was taken by photographer Carol M. Highsmith in 2021. Akers created the mural at the invitation of the Osage Nation and city government of Cuba, Missouri, which hoped for a scene that would reflect Osage history. And you see that here in this image. The land is prominently featured in the form of waterways and lush greenery. Tribal representatives occupy the space in the foreground at left, while men in European clothing, arrivals from France, are visible at right, including in an inset double portrait. Akers has said, quote, through visual narrative, I explore how my point of view relates to a historical, political, and cultural sense of place in contemporary society. The use of narrative in my work acts as a continuation of the Native American storytelling tradition. End quote. This photograph is from Shelley Nero's Battlefields of My Ancestors series, which documents locations of historic conflicts involving the Haudenosaunee people. Some of the photographs in the series, like this one, capture signs or monuments erected by local governments commemorating battles, all from a European American perspective. Signs like these have played a role in the cultural erasure or minimizing of Indigenous presence in these areas. This sign centers European Americans and location names in the description of this conflict and uses passive language to describe the destruction of an unnamed Indian village by American forces during the 1779 Sullivan Clinton campaign, during which dozens of Mohawk villages were razed and thousands of Haudenosaunee people were forced to flee, all in retaliation for their support of British forces during the Revolutionary War. Nero's photos document the Haudenosaunee people's movement from New York to Ontario after the conflict, emphasizing the ongoing presence of people from the same communities on both sides of the US Canada border, and the imposition of national boundaries by people and nations from outside their traditional boundaries. The photos in the Battlefields of My Ancestors series show how Haudenosaunee people have remained connected, culturally and spiritually, to their traditional homelands. And now, back to Catherine.
Thank you. This wry self-portrait lithograph by Kay Walkingstick also invites audiences to look and think deeper, to question assumptions and what we think we know. Walkingstick is a citizen of the Cherokee Nation who was the first Native American artist to appear in H.R. Jansen's influential History of Art textbook in 1995. This lithograph relates to Walkingstick's Talking Leaves series, with its title and tribute to Sequoia's invention of a Cherokee language syllabary and the idea of the power of language. On the left are the words, "You're an Indian? I thought you were a Jewish girl from Queens who changed her name." This comes from a series of actual quotes, words said to the artist over the years by colleagues, strangers, and sometimes friends. Walkingstick combines humor, exasperation, and her own direct experience to shine a light here on misperceptions and issues of identity. This work comes from our Robert Blackburn printmaking workshop collection. And collecting works from regional studios and workshops is another way that we work to bring in a variety of voices and subjects and places and more. Here are a monoprint and offset lithograph by artist Rick Bartow, published respectively by the Rutgers Center for Innovative Print and Paper, now called the Brodsky Center in New Jersey, and the Brandywine Printmaking Workshop in Philadelphia. Bartow was an artist, musician, and member of the Mad River Band of Wyatt Indians. Animals with significance in Native American mythology recur in the artist's work, and here we see a raven bundle on the left and coyote on the right. As a Vietnam veteran, Bartow considered art to be a form of medicine and healing. Like many fellow creators, he drew inspiration from many different artistic and cultural traditions, saying, quote, "I'm an artist who happens to be Indian. I'm involved in what I can find in my culture, and I use that in my work. Wisdom is wisdom." Dene artist and composer Raven Shakan dedicated his Forzi Kalasha series of graphic scores to contemporary American Indian, First Nations, and Mestiza women working in music performance, composition, and sound art. The series is named for the Yankton, Dakota composer and musician who is also a poet, writer, and founder of the National Council of the American Indian. Raven Shakan explains that, quote, "The scores function as both transcriptive portraits of the contemporary Indigenous women artists and how they navigate the 21st century, drawing on a range of symbols, including Western music notation, tribal geometries, and numerology, among more ambiguous designs." That's the end of the quote. The two that we have in the Library of Congress collection honor Barbara Crowell and Anishinaabe composer, and Heidi Zanangatuk, who is an Inupiaq musician and ethnomusicologist. Musical language plays a key role in this work as well. A 2017 diptych by Seneca artist Marie Watt called Companion Species. It meditates on Marvin Gaye's 1970s, late 1960s, in fact, an evergreen anthem called What's Going On. And here is what the artist says about her intention and thinking. She wrote, while the anti war, anti hate activism content is resonant, what first caught my attention is the way the lyrics acknowledge family members mother, mother, brother, brother, sister, father, and signals our relatedness beyond a biological construct. End quote. So these are part of a larger body of work by the artist exploring these ideas and extending that idea, that concept of companion species further to include animals and the natural world. And now again, let's hear from Melissa.
Thanks, Catherine. Like some of the images Catherine just described, this one combines multiple artistic forms, and in this case, those forms are photography and poetry. The artist Sky Hopinka is a member of the Ho-Chunk Nation with ancestry in the Pechanga Band of Luiseño Indians, and he's already received acclaim both nationally and internationally in recognition of his innovative work. This image from Hopinka's series Breathings shows a view of a city intersection with a ghostly skyline visible in the background. Hopinka used a film camera to create the images, and then he scanned the negatives and ultimately produced an inkjet print. Etched around the edge of the photo is text that Hopinka added using a rotary tool. It reads, quote, I think of my home tonight. I don't have any resolutions, but I felt so much through these streets, these neighborhoods. This land and this land hold so much, and this pain call for salves we already have, still needing to be wrapped in poulticed, end quote. And the artist has likened the text to prayer. The city depicted here, Chicago, holds some personal meaning for Hopinka since it's located on the southern end of traditional Ho-Chunk lands. At the same time, Hopinka has said that, quote, I think about how I can express those parts of my relationship to my identity and culture without being overly didactic, end quote. This open approach enables different viewers, including the artist, to see different meanings in the images. Back to Catherine.
I love that. We'll keep going here with the poetry connections. This vibrant artwork was made by artists John Hitchcock and Emily Arthur, who both teach at the University of Wisconsin-Madison in the printmaking department. This is part of a series called The Americas, inspired by reflections of former US poet laureate Joy Harjo's book, An American Sunrise. The work itself is a form of visual poetry rather than a literal interpretation, though I was able to track down the word timekeeper, the title word. It appears in Harjo's poem called Break My Heart, which includes these lines. The heart is a fist, it pockets prayer or holds rage. It's a timekeeper. A musician as well as artist, John Hitchcock is an enrolled member of the Kiowa tribe of Oklahoma and Comanche, who runs his own hybrid press. He grew up on Comanche tribal lands in the Wichita Mountains of Oklahoma near Fort Sill military base. And we regularly see his incorporation of mythological hybrid animals in his work. So here you can see buffalo containing running horses and flying geese, as well as a large dragonfly, which he told me was one of Emily's contributions to the composition. He also credits his beadwork artist grandma as an important influence. Emily Arthur is of Cherokee descent, and in the artist's own words, she sees nature as an interdependent living force rather than as the backdrop for human events, with an ongoing concern for the environment, displacement, exile, and the return home from dislocation and separation. These monoprint lithographs come from the Sun Carrier series by artist Yadika Star Fields, who is Osage, Cherokee, and Creek. The series embraces some recurring influences in his work, including the natural world and also street art and graffiti aesthetics, which you can see in the very fluid gestural lines and strokes that he's using here. The artist has also described the importance of color and how it can function as a kind of medicine. These images are both abstract and representational, showing glimpses of organic plant forms, a rattlesnake, orbs in the sunrise position, and a recurring golden sun in the style of French King Louis XIV, who was called the Sun King. Titles like Divine Rain, and at the far right, if you can see, there's a little fleur-de-lis symbol. These lead my mind down the path of thinking of histories of war and conquest in relation to nature and the land. In his artist statement, Field says that his compositions are often spontaneous and open to multiple interpretations. This Jeffrey Gibson monotype also has a dimensional layered quality that invites deep, long looking. It's called Stranger Number 15, and I hope you can glimpse the face in the lower half, peering through abstract painterly brushes and waves of woven color. The artist said that he derived the face from several different images of people pulled from the internet. This too is part of a series in which each piece has unique monoprint painting, which causes that face to seem to shift and change depending on these different environments of color, pattern, and energy. Gibson hopes that the viewer will engage with what he has conceptualized and created to then actively read and interpret the image. Part of the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians and Cherokee Nation, Jeffrey Gibson became the first Indigenous artist to represent the United States solo at the Venice Biennale in 2024 earlier this year. Here are two posters by artist Crystal Worrell that were acquired as part of the library's rapid response collecting during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. They're also part of our larger collection of posters published by the Seattle-based publisher Amplifier. Amplifier put out a global call inviting the submission of artworks promoting mental health, well-being, and social change. The resulting artworks, including these examples with messages in English and Tlingit, were then made freely available as digital downloads, which circulated widely on social media and also as printed posters. So they were intended to go viral in a good way, and in the US and internationally. Based in Juneau, Alaska, Worrell is Tlingit Athabaskan from Raven Moiety, Sakai clan from the Raven House. Jim Yellowhawk, who is a member of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe, often takes inspiration from traditional Lakota art and the storytelling tradition of ledger art. You can see that style here, down to the cosmic looking coronavirus shapes in the sky, called oh my goodness, excuse me, Stay at Home, called Stay at Home. This is also part of our Amplifier COVID-19 poster collection. The artist said that he started by wondering what his ancestors would think. So he decided to place them in the shelter of their home, surrounded them by a bubble of safety. And the colors represent all the people of the world, extending that wish for safety and protection to everybody. There's a medicine wheel near the lower right and a buffalo who faces the storm, the crisis, the health crisis with strength. The stars represent those around the world who lost their lives to the disease. The eagle feathers around the circle and the eagle soaring above are all sending prayers. Multimedia artist Lillian Pitt is from the Big River or Columbia River region of the Pacific Northwest. She was born on the Warm Springs Reservation in Oregon and is descended from Wasco, Yakima, and Warm Springs people. As well as a wonderful printmaker, she is known as a sculptor and mixed media creator whose works often explore over 10,000 years of Native American history and tradition, including rock carvings and paintings of her Columbia River ancestors. The artist's goal includes incorporating traditional ancestral arts into her own contemporary artworks. In every medium, she says, quote, "My works directly relate to and honor my ancestors, the environment, and the animals," end quote. And the titles of these two are Owl Dance and Ancestors. And now back to Melissa.
Thanks, Catherine. Russell Albert Daniels's work, which you see here, examines the interaction of Indigenous and European American cultures on the Utah landscape, mirroring somewhat the complexity of his own identity, with Dene, Ho-Chunk, and Mormon settler heritage and family membership in the Northern Ute tribe. This image and the one on the next slide are from Daniels's Untitled Plateau series, which looks at Indigenous cultural sites and how they're currently used, while also showing geological features and human impacts on the environment in places where multiple cultures have inhabited land for thousands of years. One site Daniels has documented is Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Culture National Historical Park in Nageezi, New Mexico, which is seen in this image. Here we see tourists entering a doorway at Pueblo Bonito in 2018. Although thousands of ancestral indigenous sites are preserved, many are not, with the status of protection, the protection of surrounding land often remaining uncertain. Daniels was inspired to photograph at Bears Ears National Monument after 5 tribes, the Hopi tribe, Navajo Nation, Ute Mountain Ute tribe, Pueblo Zuni, and Ute Indian tribe, came together to create the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition in 2015. The coalition states that it is working to protect Bears Ears, quote, by developing a land management plan for the greater Bears Ears landscape that is rooted in our indigenous perspectives and place-based conservation strategies developed over centuries, end quote. In the last couple of years, the Bears Ears Intertribal Coalition formalized a partnership with the Bureau of Land Management and the U.S. Forest Service to co-manage the Bears Ears National Monument, reflecting broader acknowledgement of the importance of tribal communities' ongoing influence on how their land is used. In Daniels' images, we can see enduring evidence of ancient and ongoing indigenous life in the area, embodied in homes, petroglyphs, pottery, and more. This photograph of a corn cob, possibly ancestral Puebloan, presents Bears Ears not just as a historic site, but a place where Native people of the Colorado Plateau have continuously lived for centuries and remain today. Back to Catherine.
Thank you. Here is another place-based image, this time by Cheyenne Arapaho artist Edgar Heap of Birds. It's called Nuffermadoc. His colorful abstraction takes that title word Nuf from the Cheyenne word for four, and this is part of a larger series of related paintings and prints. His organic shapes, textures, and colors can be read as responses to forest, including juniper trees, water, sky, red earth, and other features of Cheyenne and Arapaho tribal lands, as well as other places. And here the title references the Modoc Nation of Northern California and Southern Oregon, who fought US military troops in resistance to the removal of their homelands during the late 19th century. Continuing with the subject of the land, we turn again to Kay Walking Stick, whose work we looked at earlier. This panoramic aquatint etching called Trip Hammer is part of a series Walking Stick made in 1989 while grieving the death of her husband. The title refers to Trip Hammer Falls in Ithaca, New York, on the campus of Cornell University, where she was a professor of art from 1998 until her retirement as professor emerita in 2005. Walking Stick is known for her landscapes and their metaphorical relationships to Native Americans and all citizens. She says, quote, "The landscape sustains us physically and spiritually. It is our beautiful corner of the cosmos," end quote. The library's Prints and Photographs division is fortunate to preserve and share 5 works dating from 1989 to 2010 by Kay Walking Stick in our Robert Blackburn printmaking workshop and Crow's Shadow Institute collections. And now back to Melissa.
Thank you. Louis DeSoto is a Cahuilla artist who works in sculpture and multimedia installation in addition to photography, and his work is also deeply connected to place. He received a Guggenheim Fellowship just this year for his work. DeSoto's images in the Prints and Photographs Division collections come from two of his photographic series. The first series, Empire, documents sites in Southern California's Inland Empire, which consists of valley, mountain, and desert landscapes of undeveloped land, as well as growing urban areas in Riverside, San Bernardino, and Palm Springs. This area is where DeSoto grew up, and it comprises the traditional homelands of the Cahuilla people, a fact I never knew when growing up in the area myself. In this image from 2013, the boarded up windows of this house with Spanish tile roof point to the area's colonial history and the recent boom and bust housing cycle. The thriving condition of the fruit laden orange tree contrasts with the neglect of the property. DeSoto's photographic series Power documents energy production sites in California. By producing the photographs in panoramic format, DeSoto emphasizes the massive scale of these sites, and by including the broader landscape, we get a sense of the geological impact of these projects on the surrounding land. The titles of DeSoto's photographs name the communities on whose land these sites are located. Here we see snake-like oil pipelines that form part of McKittrick oil field, infiltrating the landscape on the traditional homelands of the Chumash people. This panoramic image of Shasta Dam, built on traditional Winnemem-Wintu waters and lands, shows the impact of energy projects on an even more monumental scale. Building the Shasta Dam during World War II displaced Winnemem-Wintu people and interrupted the traditional migratory pathways of salmon or nur, which have been vital to the tribe's sustenance and culture for thousands of years. Winnemem-Wintu translates to middle water people in their language. The tribe is not federally recognized, but members continue to fight for that status. Lack of federal recognition prevents members from obtaining resources that would otherwise be more freely available to them, including grants that could be used to help preserve their language and an ability to have a say in how sacred spaces are used and protected. Brian Adams is an Inupiaq photographer whose work over the past decade has explored the impact of climate change on the lands and lives of Inuit people in northern Alaska and Canada. This photograph of a caved-in ice cellar on the coast of Kaktovik, Alaska, reveals how parts of the indigenous built environment, including historic sites, have faded from the landscape due to erosion along coastlines, sinking land, and other changes. Adams's portrait and landscape photos document communities that are honoring their indigenous traditions while coping with change imposed from external forces. This stunning photo of Marie Rexford standing outside her home in Kaktovik was made as part of Adams's series I'm Inuit and embodies the convergence of traditional indigenous and colonial cultures. Adams captured this photo as Rexford was preparing pieces of bowhead whale for her community's Thanksgiving meal. Adams's work documents the lives of 21st century Inuit people as a means of countering false impressions of indigenous people who live in these areas. He has said of the Inuit people he has photographed, quote, "Not only are their traditions very alive, they have adapted and persisted despite many attempts to eradicate them," end quote. A recurring theme in some of Adams's photos is the use of what he terms youthful cultural signifiers, exemplified in this photograph titled Inuit Youth Driving a Four-Wheeler in Norvik, Alaska with the Kobuk River behind them. These photos serve as proof of the vitality of Indigenous communities, even in the face of difficulty and uncertainty. That wraps up the portion of our presentation that features specific works of art by Indigenous American artists. but we do want to emphasize that there is much more to see in the collections. We're pleased to say that we recently published a research guide highlighting Indigenous American artists in the Prints and Photographs Division collections, and you can see the URL here on the screen. We have over 50 artists listed in the guide so far, with links to descriptions of their work in the collections. We'd also like to point out that the Library of Congress recently published a guide that brings together many different types of resources of the Library of Congress that relate to Indigenous communities in the Americas, including manuscript material, historical sound recordings, historical newspapers, and much more. So please explore this resource if you have any interest. Catherine and I would like to thank the artists featured in today's presentation for allowing us to share their amazing work with you today. And we want to thank all of you for joining us. We also would like to credit the early work of colleagues, including Jennifer Brathoft, Beverly Brannon, Marisha Battle, and others in helping to develop and connect more researchers with these collections. And beyond the Library of Congress, we're grateful to our colleagues at the Smithsonian National Museum of the American Indian for generous collaboration, guidance, and support as we continue work to build the collections. Well, thank you all very much for attending. We really appreciate your being here, and have a great day.